I have a long history of writing, performing, watching, and booking live music. But what I haven't been able to articulate until relatively recently is that in the last 5 years, since I've started writing and performing experimental electronic music specifically, I've developed a strange relationship with the concept of live, and have started to think about what that word has the potential to mean in the context of music, compelling me to experiment with many different ways music can be presented in the live context, and developing ways of presenting live music in a way that's beyond entertainment. So what I'm about to discuss is a culmination of these experiments, which I have developed into what I believe to be a revolutionary new paradigm for live music, which I present in the final chapter of my forthcoming book album, Modify, Revitalizing Originality in an Ideological World, and directly applied to my Pure Experience workshop. It's largely influenced by a small but prominent network of experimental electronic artists from across the globe, some of whom I've gotten the opportunity to discuss these topics with directly, who have been adopting various pieces of this paradigm throughout their careers, but who have never cohesively theorized the entire puzzle. That's what I'm going to attempt to do here. The live experiences of the music component of Modify occur in the near or complete darkness at psychophysiologically intense frequencies, with the purpose of transcending ego consciousness through an attempt to transition the audience into states of pure experience, effectively closing, rather than filling, the gap between who we are and who we should be. Quasi-comparable to what we might experience on psychedelics, but without the necessity of pharmacological intervention. In preparing for a psychedelic experience, it's often advised that we have the right set and setting, that is, the right mindset going into the experience, and the right setting in which the experience will be held. However, we need not dualistically separate these two, the set being our internal minds, and the setting being the external world. Because it's possible to set up conditions such that they are in absolute reciprocal union with each other, as to not necessitate any differentiation between set and setting. The undifferentiation of set and setting means that the pure experiential setting itself evokes a pure experiential set, which is what I attempt to do in Modify sound experiences. There are 4 principles regarding how music is written, how music is listened to, how music is seen, and how music is performed that I integrate, and that anyone can integrate, to achieve this undifferentiated state. 1. How music is written has everything to do with how it's experienced. The intention behind my compositional process for Modify is to make music with archetypally dynamic affect, meaning that it doesn't tell a personal story, but rather transpersonally evokes a story to be told, which will be different for all of us according to the idiosyncratic archetypal configurations of our lives, which are always subject to change. Modify is intended to be a catalyst to an egoless journey through and within the creative and destructive cycle of pure experience, as to evoke a quote-unquote secular transcendence, as Tim Hecker called it, of the ego barriers that prevent us from having pure experiences. Terence McKenna famously said that taking a heroic dose of psilocybin mushrooms, 5 or more grams, is properly done in silent darkness, implying that psychedelic experiences without music are somehow more pure than those with music. This is certainly true in regards to music that communicates any message that can be interpreted at the level of the ego, but precisely the opposite is the case when the music that guides the experience is archetypal, because archetypes are pure by their very nature. So archetypal music will facilitate rather than prevent us from deepening our states of pure experience, no matter how those states are approached. I once had a 7.2 gram psilocybin experience where I tried McKenna's approach, and realized as the effects were kicking in, that challenging myself to refrain from playing music was itself an ego barrier to pure experience. As soon as I made this realization, I felt an intuitive calling to play some of the instrumental artists that had consistently brought me into states of pure experience prior, and nothing felt more right. In pure experience, time transcends temporality, which is why I attempt to make the temporal length of Modify music irrelevant, as to facilitate a continuous presence that is not bound by temporality. Temporality being our left hemispheric harnessing of time as a fragmented process of numbers, intervals, and sequences. On a deeper level, a great accomplishment for a composer would be to create an experience that completely transcends not only temporality, but any static value pattern the listener may have that would impede them from purely experiencing the composer's music. A master accomplishment would be to create that same experience on indefinite repeat, such that the composer's music would maintain its dynamic quality from the listener's perspective, so they would never get sick of it, as it would continue to act as a portal to pure experience. A supplement to that, which is perhaps an even more difficult master accomplishment, would be to create music that is too complex to be remembered while it's not being listened to, as to not be able to be represented by any form outside of itself. If a composer can do all of those things while making the sound of their music have a quote-unquote pop accessibility, well, then they have accomplished perhaps the most difficult feat in music. 2. How music is listened to has everything to do with how it's experienced. Mark Fisher, most famously known as the author of capitalist realism, Is There No Alternative, once had a student who he saw listening to music on his iPhone speaker, and asked him why he chose that medium rather than headphones, being that he could barely hear what was coming out of the speakers. The student told him that he enjoyed the feeling of having it in the background, even though he wasn't paying attention to it, an answer that disturbed Fisher. How could one enjoy passively listening to music, he wondered. The same could be asked about why some people enjoy having the TV on in the background while working on an unrelated project. It's as if Brian Eno's formula that ambient music should be quote-unquote as ignorable as it is listenable is now applicable to all media. I've had similar experiences at various shows I've played or attended at DIY spaces, where it's almost seen as a virtue to adapt to subpar sound systems that are incapable of amplifying certain frequency ranges. It's one thing to adapt to whatever equipment is available out of material necessity, but it's quite another to adapt to it out of perceived virtue. The latter is a symptom of a trend in DIY communities where pride is taken in the impotent act of settling for less, which is nested in a deeper collective feeling that our psyches are forever trapped within the ontological constraints of capitalist realism and are fated to be enslaved by it. The widespread tendency to consume media in an inattentive way is a symptom of the much larger problem of passively existing in every aspect of our lives. Eno's quote-unquote ambient sound philosophy is the opposite of the quote-unquote maximal sound philosophy I use for Modify. If ambient music should be as ignorable as it is listenable, maximal music should be as listenable as it is noticeable. If we apply this philosophy to ambient music, we'll listen to Sigur Rós's album Liminal Sleep not to wind down, but to wake up, not to relax our bodies, but to engage them. To demonstrate this philosophy in the live context, the volume must hit the sweet spot of intensity as to be psychophysiologically demanding, but not unbearable, which usually occurs within the range of 100 to 130 decibels, depending on our idiosyncratic sensitivities. At this decibel range, our capacities for listening are no longer limited to the ear, but expand to the entire body, a distinction I learned from Lawrence English, who has done a large amount of intellectual and experiential research into the phenomenology of listening. Listening with the entire body is a holistic practice I call psychophysiological listening, which is essentially a sound bath on steroids. Sound must be considered within the context of the space in which it's amplified, and accordingly tuned to the room, as Lawrence taught me. A friend of mine joked while we were on tour a couple of years ago that we had to borrow gear for every show, because at every show we had to figure out how to adapt our sound differently according to the specific PA it was amplified out of and the specific room in which it was amplified, rather than just showing up with a bunch of gear and having a relatively consistent idea of how we were going to sound. This was a big lesson in adaptability for us, being that we played in many different types of venues which each had different types of PAs and different room layouts. While our sounds were never consistent from show to show, this inconsistency was part of the thrill of booking and playing a DIY tour. In addition to sound, the other primary aspect of live performance I consider is lighting, or lack of it. 3. How music is seen has everything to do with how it's experienced. This is true even if vision is completely cut off. Consciousness is hegemonically anchored to vision. Being that sight is the sense that's most easily detached from the body, it should be of no surprise that our capacity to see has become increasingly cognitivized by our left hemispheres over the course of Western history, as to steer our attention towards the image of music rather than the sound of it, to what it means in the mind rather than how it feels in the body. This sensory bias toward vision is the case in not only the entertainment industry, but in most situations, no matter how anti-capitalist, in which live music is held. There's a ubiquitous commodity fetish of seeing composers physically perform their music as a naturalized component of the live music experience. It can no doubt be boring to watch a composer turn knobs on a mixer or pedal board or change settings on a laptop, being that there's no performative spectacle associated with doing so. But whenever we find ourselves in a state of boredom by doing so, we should ask ourselves, are we looking at the right thing? Is there something we're not seeing? The reason I've done so many performances in the complete darkness is precisely to answer this question, because in complete darkness, we see more by seeing less, by way of synesthesia, ego dissolution, and interconnection. In complete darkness, we are no longer forced to associate the sounds we hear with the images we see, allowing our visual cortexes a synesthetic opportunity to literally see the music we hear, uncovering a more complex mode of sensory perception than our bodies are culturally conditioned to experience. Experiencing live music in complete darkness also facilitates the dissolution of our egos and our senses of interconnection, as the lack of visual imagery removes the option of being distracted by the visual images of the people surrounding us, which may lead to judgments about how either we or they are experiencing the show. So not having access to those images can invoke a sense of egoless interconnection that we're all experiencing this together as an archetypal network. This reasoning was jointly influenced by the intention behind the performance aesthetic of the band Sun to dissolve identity, as well as a conversation I had with Kara-Lis about individual and collective development via the experience of music. Sun wears robes every time they perform live with the purpose of dissolving their individual identities, to get the audience to focus their attention not on them as performers, but on the entire sonic field in which they are all situated. One of their founding members, Stephen O'Malley, has emphasized how this aesthetic is particularly useful when they bring in well-known guests to perform with them, such as the band Boris or Justin Broderick of the bands Yesu and Godflesh. So the audience doesn't get fixated on what any single member is playing based on how they assume they will sound because of how they sound in their other projects, as to completely dissolve any notion of individual identity while watching Sun, both from the perspectives of the band and the audience. The conversation I had with Coverdale was after a performance she did in LA during the time when I was developing my reasoning for how narratives in any artistic medium can depict the process of individual development. And after I told her why I think this is, she responded by saying that she doesn't think the process I was referring to is individual, but rather, quote, this one big thing, end quote, which got me thinking a lot more about how artistic narratives don't just depict individual development, but on a deeper level, collective development. They open up a dynamic space in which we can all take part in the synthetic process of archetypal change, especially in a situation such as a shared live music experience. In addition to the ways music is written, listened to, and seen, however, there still remains another barrier to purely experiencing it that often uniquely lurks in the shadow of the hegemonic way much of today's experimental electronic music is quote-unquote performed. 4. How music is performed has everything to do with how it's experienced. Traditional performances are such that composers have one-to-one relationships with our instruments, as to be able to physically quote-unquote play everything that's being heard. This association has hegemonized our visual correlation between seeing a performance and hearing it, both as performers and audiences. When the spectacle of the quote-unquote laptop musician arrived around the turn of the century, our hegemonic idea of what performance is was challenged, as we were introduced to the task of dissociating what we're seeing from what we're hearing. This dissociation has been a challenge for a majority of experimental electronic posers who aren't able to have the same one-to-one relationship with our instruments during live performances as traditional performers were, often due to the sheer impossibility of physically quote-unquote playing music that was synthesized from many different sources, which, even at the quote-unquote source sound level, is often not a quote-unquote instrument that is quote-unquote playable. To use an example from the album introduction to my book album, I can't quote-unquote play a boulder tumbling down a Norwegian glacier. I can only play back a recording of it. This need to play back a recording of a sound that's not a playable instrument is an inevitable quote-unquote performance method of many experimental electronic composers, leaving our options of how to quote-unquote perform those sounds limited to various methods of processing via analog or digital tools, which present a boring spectacle of computer clicking, knob turning, and fader adjusting. Being that we, as performers and audiences, are still hegemonically fixated on the correlation of the sight of the performer and the sound of the performed, it's not uncommon for composers whose music cannot be performed through the physical quote-unquote playing of an instrument to perpetuate the commodity fetish of our hegemonic sight-sound correlation in spectacles such as wearable MIDI controllers and over-the-top modular synthesizers. This fetishization has put pressure on those of us who are keen to withdraw from the sight-sound spectacle to participate in it. We're always being expected to be quote-unquote doing something that can be watched for the audience's entertainment. What's the issue with this? It alienates the performer and the listener from the music. When a one-to-one relationship between sound and sight is impossible to establish, an immoral gap between value and experience is opened. When composers are not able to physically quote-unquote play the music we're amplifying and are being watched by listeners, both we and the listeners are forced to alienate our capacities to hear the performance from our capacities to see it in our fetishized attempts to create a one-to-one relationship between sound and sight that is impossible to create. Any of us who have performed or listened to live experimental electronic music know what this feels like, and it's a feeling that's widely sensed yet hardly articulated. In my experience, from a performer's standpoint, it's a feeling of disconnection from both the music and the listener, anxiety about the performance being perceived as quote-unquote fake by the listener, and frustration with the capitalist realist paradigm in which this perception is embedded. These feelings can certainly be avoided when the performance conditions are such that the setting of the venue is intentionally set up to evoke a pure experiential set in the performer and listener, but it's all too often the case that the performer's fixation on playing something we aren't playing, and the listener's fixation on seeing us play something they aren't hearing, alienates us both from purely experiencing what we're fundamentally there to experience, the music. None of us chose for it to be this way, yet here we are, gaslighted by capitalist realism into a collective feeling of guilt for attempting to liberate live music from its sound-sight commodity fetish. When we were approaching this issue during a conversation we had in Vancouver, Scott Morgan, who composes and performs under the name Lossel, made the point that when we go to theaters to watch films, we do so to watch films, not to look at projectionists. We need to adopt this same paradigm with live music. When we go to venues to hear music, we should do so to hear music, not to look at performers, insofar as watching a performance alienates us from hearing it, which is the case when a one-to-one relationship between what's being heard and what's being seen can't be established, a regular occurrence in all kinds of electronic music performances across the world. The commodity fetish of the sound-sight performance spectacle needs to be abolished in order to liberate a vast swath of creators and consumers of electronic music from the ontological constraints of the particular mode of capitalist realism that manifests in the entertainment industry as a default expectation on performers and audiences to establish a one-to-one relationship between sound and sight. What this means on a practical level is that performers who can't establish this one-to-one relationship should be allowed to simply play back our music in a live setting without being forced to attempt to quote-unquote play it, and thereby eliminate the audience and performer alienation that's caused by the sound-sight commodity fetish. We should be allowed to play back our music in venues just as directors are allowed to play back their films in theaters, and we should get paid to do it. There should be venues across the world who are willing to host a listening of an album, just as theaters across the world are willing to host a screening of a film, whether the composer or director is there or not. Live performances should always be an option for composers, but they should never be a limitation. We should not be required to perform live in order for our music to be experienced live, as this limitation not only alienates performers and listeners from purely experiencing live music, but also acts as a major barrier for composers to excel in our careers, especially those who don't have the resources to tour, aren't able to tour, or simply don't want to tour. The locus of responsibility for manifesting this new paradigm into action is shared amongst composers, listeners, and stakeholders. We're not talking about hosting more quote-unquote listening parties. We're talking about changing the ontological fabric of live music at scale. If we are to make listenings happen at scale, composers need to be willing to play back our music live without performing it, listeners need to be willing to listen to music live without it being performed, and stakeholders need to be willing to organize, fund, and host listenings with or without composers being present. This paradigm operates with the ontological assumption that music is itself a life form that can provide a powerful live experience that is not delivered by its composer in real time, facilitating an experience of the in itself of music without anyone telling it what to do. This revolutionary new paradigm for live music is only one of many methods to transcend the ontological constraints of not only capitalist realism, but of every form of ideological realism, which it does by providing a direct portal to pure experience, which is the phenomenological essence of originality. Live music is only one of many domains that's in major need of an ontological paradigm shift. There are many conservative edifices in all domains that are preventing their ontological foundations from being rebuilt. So let's each use our idiosyncratic talents to do the difficult work of creatively transforming the domains in which we specialize, and originalize the many unoriginal microcosms through which our minds, bodies, and spirits are ideologically mediated.